And is the poll on, Kartika? I never know. Maybe now is a good time to put the poll out there. So while we're waiting for people to trickle in,
Yeah,
you have some questions to answer.
I launch it.
Those who are just joining us, we have a poll there while we wait a couple of minutes. Please give us a sense of how things are going for you.
I'm not able to submit my response in the poll.
Really? Is anybody else having that problem? Who are you? Sahil? No.
Shreyans.
Shreyans.
Yeah.
Maybe you could just drop off and get back in. Maybe that would fix it.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that.
So sorry.
For those who are saying they don't have space on their device for another app, Dara is also available for browser. You do not need to download anything.
No, then at some point she went and hugged Ranjit. And it was a laugh. It was quite hilarious. Like, I know she knows.
Okay. We're 3 minutes in, and I think that's kind of the grace time we give folks. So to those of you who are here on time, thank you. And nice to see all of you again. So in this touch point, the way we're looking at things is we have Sahil Thapa, and we'll introduce him in a little bit, who will speak to us about his experiences of navigating the world of open source for creative practices with communities as well. We have a little bit of, I think there is some confusion and dilemmas on the pitch and the proposal and finding collaborators and all those messy things before we get started. So we will address a little bit of that to get a sense of how many of you are pitching, how many of you have collaborators, how many of you are still looking for them, what kind of help and support you need from us. So after doing that, then we will go on to, we had put out a call for leveraging community wisdom, and we didn't get many takers. It would be nice to know from all of you why you felt you didn't have the, we offered you space to hold, to discuss whatever's on your mind. We had one person who volunteered, and so Shreyans Iyer from our community will be given the mic to discuss a few ideas that he has with respect to the rules of engagement within an open source community. So how can the ideology of open source permeate in the way we engage with each other as we go ahead with our projects? So that's something that he's going to help us unpack. And yeah, so that's kind of the agenda for today. Kartika, I'm going to hand it over to you. To help everybody get on board Dara.
Just give me a moment. So for people who have not yet got onto Dara, please, I don't know, just scan this. It will take you to the link, and please get onto Dara right away. It's a little difficult to repeat information across so many platforms. We use Dara as our primary mode of communication. It's easy. So please just scan this if you haven't already gotten onto Dara. And if you have any difficulties with this, please write to us and we can help you with this as well.
Yes, we have a group of 110 members, and we can see only 17 of you being active on this platform and reading the announcements that we send you. Like Kartika mentioned, it is really hard for us to be sending out emails on top of communication that we've already done. We have two main platforms. Dara gives you announcements, but everything that we put out on Dara is stored in this Miro space, and you can definitely find it. For those of you who are finding Miro tough to use, please let us know and we will set up a Miro kind of tutorial, either as a video or as face-to-face time on helping you navigate this. These are really effective tools that have helped us in fellowships in the past, and that's why we use them here. So please jump aboard both Dara and Miro to stay abreast of what's going on.
All right, so with that, we will introduce you to our guest speaker for the evening, Sahil Thapa. Sahil Thapa is a maker, tinkerer, and a faculty in product design at the National Institute of Design. While at NID, he has been working in the domain of design democracy, open design, making sustainable development co-creation, digital fabrication, and alternative industrial design practices. He has collaborated and worked with organizations and firms like Mozilla, Riverside School, Design Against Crime, Quicksand, Fab Lab, and so many more. So thank you, Sahil Thapa, for joining us today. And over to you.
Just a second, sorry. Sorry for that, I'm on campus, so yeah. So thank you so much for inviting me and being part of the group. There are certain disclaimers I would like to make before I begin. I believe that I'm part of this philosophy of being in lifelong kindergarten. So though I officially have a post of a faculty, but I don't think that I still know a lot. So that's something which is really consciously there in my mind, or the back of my mind, that the moment we figure out that we know everything, we stop learning. So I think I would like to go ahead with that thing in my mind. And I think that's also something, when I think about open source, or when I think about open, the word open, that's something which comes to my mind, is being open to what is out there, or being open to what you don't know or what you know. So that's something I would like to start with. And I worked with kids, I worked with prisoners, I worked with communities, made objects which were as small as the size of my thumbnail to as big as architectural projects. And this thing which has remained constant throughout this was the fact that whatever I was doing, I was interested in sharing it with people. And lately, I've figured out that using Creative Commons is the best way, because I don't have to think too much. And I've been using platforms like blogs, Instructables, social media, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, like whatever tool I can use, I use it. So what I'll do is, the way I've structured my presentation is, it's going to be certain sort of probes or provocations in terms of what is open. And I would like to run through certain projects or certain established system which exist right now, and look at that from the perspective of open source. Yeah. And I'll come back to what Kama is saying in the end, because I think that sort of connects it back. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
So this is a old question which I have been thinking upon, and it goes like, what is the end purpose of design, or what is the end purpose of doing all these things? Like, there's 7 billion of us on this planet, and most of us are fighting for our survival. And what could happen if people can actually do the things they want to do rather than just fight for survival? Because everyone is a creative person, and we can see that because of the tool like internet, which has to an extent democratized information and knowledge. A kid who's as young as 5 years could be a designer, uh, as a person who's in their 80s. So everyone has the potential to thrive. It's just that because of lack of access to resources or other tools, people end up not living up to their full potential or doing the things they want to. So that's sort of something which keeps me pushing throughout. Like, if given access or if given the resources, people can do wonders. And that's why I work with kids a lot. So the world has changed over the past 2 years. This is the reality we live in. Most of us have left the cozy physical world behind, and we are finding the online medium which we are using right now as the new world order. Internet has opened up possibilities which weren't there. We are not bound by the physicality of our world right now, and that's why it's a nice way which you guys have put in. Like, you have people from all across the world. So this is the new way the world might progress. I would request you guys to, the word open is there. I would request that in your chat window, whatever one word comes to your mind, please put that, and don't post it right now. Just type in the word. What does open mean to you? That's one of the questions I have. Is open or open source about making the invisible visible? Because as the world we are living in right now, there are a lot of systems around us which we don't understand. There's this entire surgence of artificial intelligence, which seems to be a nice topic to talk about, but do we really understand artificial intelligence? Do we really understand the way the world works? So is open source or open about making the invisible visible? So this is a project done by a friend of ours, Vladin Joler. He's a professor of computer science in Serbia. And in this project, the intention of this project was to make the system of artificial intelligence which exists into the system visible. Like, a lot of time we don't know what sits in there. And on the surface, this looks like a nice map, but to make something like this visible can take at least a time frame of 3 to 4 years. So how do you gather information about something which you don't know about? So this is one of the things which comes to my mind when I think about open source. Like, is it about unearthing something which has not been spoken about earlier, or do you make certain things visible? This is a project which we undertook at NID. So in this, we wanted people to understand what happens to a person who's under 18 when they commit a crime. What happens to them? Because law is something in which a lot of us don't know much about. And this was a navigational map of what happens if you commit a crime. And this is the system of Indian justice when a juvenile commits a crime. And it's really complex to navigate. And imagine that you don't know your rights, and you don't know whether something you have done is right or wrong in the eyes of the law. So will you consider this as something open or open source? Is it about access? This is a very old example. our cities are made with racism in mind. So this was an example of how cities were built in America. So the architect Robert Moses, when he was given the task to build the urban area near New York, so he made bridges in the way that the beach couldn't be accessed by buses. So the point of doing this was that you stop a lot of American African population from accessing the beaches because they didn't have access to cars. So our cities a lot of time inherently are biased. And imagine that happening on a level of a country, the scale of a country, and what it does to people when they don't have access. And then this is on the opposite end of the spectrum. Here is a designer who's reclaiming public resources. So he built an entire workspace under flyover, and he made it accessible to people. Whoever finds this, they can go up, sit, and use the space. So this is how people are looking at the entire point of access. Is it about physicality? So this is something which we discussed in our last call. So a lot of time, because of maker spaces being there, we think that everything has to be done physically, and that's the only way. Or a lot of time we think that because there's a digital platform, there's no need of physicality. So is open source about digital, or is it about analog, or is it a hybrid system of these? One thing which I've noticed in the past is that the moment people start taking ownership of what they do, they start creating emotional connection with them. So is open about taking ownership? I hope some of you might have used IKEA furniture or had the opportunity of assembling something of your own. When you make something or you assemble something on your own, you form an emotional bond with that object. So I hope if you've experienced that. So whether that's folding a paper into a small booklet, or whether that's creating one of the most fanciest car, the moment you start taking ownership of your work, you start building these connections. So is open about taking ownership? And is open also about giving people the right to control what they have? So in Europe, there's a plan of having a right to repair. There's a online resource called iFixit. So as a user or as a consumer, do I have a right to repair my products? So can I take ownership of things I've paid for? And if you see, I wanted to make sure that I have examples which are good. So if you see, Motorola Razr has score of 1. So is it fine for companies making objects which cannot be repaired? Is it fine to have planned obsolescence built into your objects? Because designing an object which can be glued is far easier than designing an object which can be taken apart into its components. So is it about giving the right to the people to tinker around? Is it about transparency? These are two phones which on surface looks very similar. The one on the left sources all its material in ethical ways. They declare where they are getting their materials from. They go to the extent of making their entire hardware modular. And on the right side, we have a phone company which has total net worth, which could be equivalent to a couple of countries together, and which is on the opposite end of the spectrum. They make their objects not to be taken apart. So is open about transparency. Like one side, I know the entire system in a clear way, and on the other side, it's a black box. Is it about sharing? I would like to say the current idea of maker spaces goes back to the Whole Earth catalog. The time Stephen Brand thought that let's put a bunch of DIY techniques and let people take ownership, and they started a magazine. And then We had people like Victor Pakpanik, who became sort of crusaders of the present day industrial design, which said that people do have a right to do the way things should be done. And they started sharing the entire work. And on the bottom right side is the present example of what sharing could be in the world of open source. Like that's the furniture designed by OpenDesk, which is under Creative Commons. So if you're using the furniture for non-commercial purpose, you can mill it in your own backyard. So how we have moved from Horror catalog to OpenDesk is something to think about. Is it about collaboration? So open source ecology for the past has been spending a lot of time building a set of machines which are going to be counterpart to, let's say, machines of John Deere. If you buy a John Deere tractor and it breaks down, you as a user cannot change the source code because the company owns that. So do we as consumers take control of that? So open source ecology has been trying to build these massive farming equipment, and they've been a big platform for sharing these. And they've drawn a very nice parallel between how much would you have to pay if you build a machine on your own compared to a machine which you buy like from a regular dealer. Is it about co-creation? So Fixpert is a platform. We talk a lot about inclusivity when it comes to open source or the world we live in right now. And Fixpert has been a champion when it comes to people with different abilities. So what Fixpert does is they take specific cases and they co-create with the end users. One example I would like to take is, which has stuck with me, is that a case study was that there was a man who had an amputation in one of the arms, and in his day-to-day life he found it difficult to wear his pants. And there come a group of designers who took him as the only user they had, and they designed the pant according to his usage. And what they did was they documented the entire project. And the good thing about Fixpert is they make it in all sort of ways, and then they release the videos throughout the world. So imagine when we try to deal with users not at big groups and as individuals, and then share the experience of how did we go about the process, that has immense potential. Rather than targeting certain people, it could be looked at in this way as well. Is it about context? So this is something which we talk about in design circles. So on the right, both of these are baby incubators. So when a kid is born prematurely, you use a baby incubator to give them warmth so that they can develop their organs really well. The image on the right side is a state-of-the-art baby incubator designed by a company like Siemens or GE. And the biggest problem is there was a case in which I think it was GE who donated a lot of baby incubators to countries in Africa. And they worked really well for a couple of years. And after a period of time, they stopped working. And what happens to these machines later on? And if you imagine that people who don't know the way tech works, what do they do with these things? So a design studio based in US called Design That Matters, what they did was they actually went to the place rather than going with a savior complex. They actually went to the place and saw what were the skills of the local people. And during the research, they figured out that there are 3 C's which can be found in every place on the planet. The first C is a cigarette, the second C is Coca-Cola, and the third C is cars. So what they figured out that the locals are really good in repairing cars. And what they did, they built the entire baby incubator using car parts. Because imagine that your car part breaks down, they're equipped enough to take apart the parts and repair it. And what they did was they also didn't standardize the components. They standardized the specifications. They said, okay, for the heating unit, you need a 12-watt lamp. They didn't say that you need a 12-watt lamp of a Corolla or a Fiat. So what happens when you go to a place and understand what is the local knowledge of the people. A lot of time we always see as a person who's going to save someone. And here is a nice example where I know what is the capacity of the local people and I build the system around it rather than making them feel stupid. So this is the importance of context in this case. This is an example of IKEA from another context. So if you see on the top left is the standard image of a IKEA table, the cheapest IKEA table you can buy. And it's standardized throughout the world, whether you're sitting in Sweden, whether you're sitting in Africa, or you're sitting in India, it looks the same. What happens to the local idea of the people? So Paolo Cardini is an industrial designer. So what he did was he gave these products and objects to the local people and told them represent it the way you see objects in your day-to-day life. A kid in Dubai has never seen a moose, but he's seen a camel. So how do you contextualize objects? Like if I'm sitting in India and I have access to Fab Lab. Fab Lab is a very, if you think about makerspaces are very, is a very Western concept where people stopped making things. You started outsourcing everything. And in India, you walk to the corner of your street and you have someone fixing an electric motor, or you have someone who's fixing your shoe. So the entire world is becoming very homogeneous. So this is where context becomes really relevant. Is it about technology? We have this thing that technology is going to save us. And here is an example of the opposite spectrum. So because Cuba is a country, because of the entire missile crisis, they were stopped from accessing the world. There were sanctions against them. So there was an alternative movement in India. We have something similar on the parallel lines called Jugaad. But I would still like to differentiate Jugaad and what Cuba did. So in Jugaad, we try to figure out a very temporary solution. But with these guys, it's not even about temporary solution. They don't have access to resources. So what they started doing is there's a term called technological disobedience. So they started tinkering with the objects. So here is a nice example of the plate in which you eat food being used as an antenna, right? So some fancy technology might not save me. It's about what I have at my disposal and what do I do best with it. So it's not always about tech is going to save us. Then this is one of my favorite examples in the current context of AI and voice assistants and everything, which are listening to most of the chats we have. So this is called Project Alias, which sits on our home devices. And what it does is it stops the device from listening to your conversations. It throws noise on the mic. And the moment you actually say a phrase which you want the device to listen to, it opens up. So imagine the implication of a small idea like this, where technology is ever pervasive. Do I want what I'm talking to my loved ones being stored in a warehouse somewhere? And how do you also take control of devices which don't have an on-off button? You cannot switch off your Alexa. So what do you do in those cases, right? Is it about privilege? A lot of time when we take pictures for Instagram, we want them to look in a very polished way, because it also comes from the context of or a place of that things need to be minimal or whatever is the trend going on right now. And that also comes from the fact of privilege. And this example, the reason I picked this example was you get tinker around the world with whatever you have at hand. So I can build a chair using a pair of twigs, a plastic bottle, and a heat source. I don't need to run a fancy CNC milling machine to make a chair. And this has huge implications beyond a chair, right? It's not about whether you have something or not. It's also about what can you do. This was a personal thing which happened to me. I was talking to someone from the States, And because I publish a lot of my work on Instructables, and I was talking to them and I was like, yeah, I do projects in which my students end up uploading their projects on Instructable. And the person said that, oh, I don't like Instructable because the company is owned by Rupert Murdoch, right? Can I, as a person, let's say in India, take a stance that, oh, because it's owned by Rupert Murdoch, I'm not going to put it? Maybe I don't have the privilege of thinking about that. Maybe all I want to do is share what I'm doing with people, and they're going to use it the way they want to use it. So should these sort of things be even important when we think about open source? Like, should we be platform dependent or should we be platform agnostic? Like, if the simplest way of telling your idea in open source is talking to someone, right? Then you can add layers of complexity. You can go to Git and all those places. So it's all come from the perspective of privilege. Is it about economics? A lot of time the question which gets asked is, how do you make money in open source? Where is the money in open source, right? And again, the intention of these slides is also to provoke or to question, like, is it about money? Is it about changing business models, or is it about the larger picture? When I see this speaker, when I see this, how I think about this as open source is, this is a speaker which has a diagnostic built in itself. If one of the component stops working, it gives you a diagnostic that this has stopped working and you should replace this. So this system is built in a modular form, which lets you take apart the components and rebuild it. So I don't need to think in terms of mass manufacturing or planned obsolescence. So I can still be open to an extent and still make money. Then this is another example which I wanted to connect to circular economy. This is a company called Gomi, which makes its product using recycled plastic, recycled drivers, and they use batteries which have been recycled from electric bikes and laptops. And as a company, they are taking a stand on their packaging. They are so proud of what they're doing is that they, on the packaging, they mention, please don't throw this in the garbage bin. We'll figure out a way to recycle it, or we can recycle it. So a lot of time we always think that open source from a very software perspective, right? So when I see these projects, they are open source to an extent because they are taking a stance of using circular materials. They are taking a stance of repairing. It might not fit the conventional definition of open source, but they're still open to an extent. Is it about communities? Because I think that's the purpose you guys are in this place, right? You are going to build things together. Precious plastic is one of the most interesting examples which has worked throughout the world. A Dutch designer had an idea, why can't we recycle plastic at a community level? And when he started the project, his intention was not to challenge the established recycling industry. All he wanted to do was recycle whatever he produces at his own level. And he ended up creating a series of 4 machines, which let him recycle all his component. And he was gentle enough to share it with the world. And now, 5 years down the line, precious plastic is a global movement where people are taking control of their own plastic and building things around them. And in India, we actually have 3 companies working with them. So it has to be something which has a larger goal, or which builds up to a larger context. This is an example which started after the oil spill in US. And this started because the government agencies were stopping people from taking a stock of what was the reality. And on the surface, they said, yeah, there's not much of a spillage. And when people wanted to take aerial pictures, stop them. So what they did was they hacked your point to shoot cameras. And yeah, so they hacked point to shoot cameras. They started deploying helium balloons and started creating an image of the entire locality. And it began as a citizen science project. Now it's a full-grown lab, which has built up a community around US and also a lot of other places. So they have grown over a period of time, and it started with the simple activity of tracking an oil leakage, using whatever components you had at home and hacking them and building things. I started the presentation with making the invisible visible, and now there's a question of making the visible invisible. So this is again a very interesting example by Paolo Cardini. So there's information overload, and we have this entire hipster culture where we want to have burnouts, where we want to work so much that we fulfill our lives, and this entire thing of multitasking. And here comes a project which stops you from multitasking or which makes you think that is multitasking really the answer. So he's hacking the devices in a very tangible way. So these are a bunch of 3D printed parts. If you only want to make a call, you put the thing and you can only make a call. You want to navigate, it's just. So how do you also make a lot of visible things invisible? Because there's information overload. See, everyone has access to internet, or everyone has access to information. And there's so much information overload that we can't synthesize, or we can't internalize information as our own knowledge. So how do we tweak the interfaces to get what we want? This is a company called Arrival, and they are challenging the way manufacturing is done. And in a mass manufactured society, we have assembly line where you have a global supply chain where you spend a lot of money on fuel, logistic, people. The point which Arrival is making is that you don't need to have massive infrastructure. Depending on what you have to produce, they follow a redistributed manufacturing system. So if, let's say in America, I only need to make trucks. So they'll only have a factory which makes trucks. And they have something called cells, which are modular in themselves. So you can keep on tweaking your assembly line to make what you want. Rather than designing 3 months down the line, you design for what you have to build tomorrow. And as a company, they are taking a stand to use sustainable materials, which follow a very circular model and which is very agile. Like it's taking Six Sigma agile to the next level. This is something critical to me. Majority of the industrial design has been coming from the context of designing for people. So there is a problem which has to be solved, and there's a client or a user. So that's what we've been doing for the past 60 years. And we always take them as people who consume things. And when we are looking at designing with people, like I gave you the example of experts. So the person for whom I'm designing, or that person's opinion or that person's problem has to be taken into account, which a normal human-centered design process doesn't. Because we take them as focus groups and all those things, and we end up losing the entire point of why are we designing in the first go. So is there a need for shifting from designing for people to designing with people? And this is a project I did. So if I ask you a question, if you have experienced this in your life, case of theft, like when you were using public transportation, if you had one of your belonging being stolen. So who's the best person to gather information about that? We went to a prison in Ahmedabad and we asked the prisoners or the inmates, how do people steal stuff? So people who are in prison are highly creative people. It's just that they're on the wrong side of the law. So these are the guys who really had insight how people steal stuff. And along with them, we ended up creating a series of anti-theft bags. And these insights were really helpful. So rather than going from this thing that, oh, I am a designer, I'm the creator, and I know everything, and using these guys as touch points, we actually went to the prison for 7 days. The bag you see on the right is the one I designed with a prisoner who normally stitches a tent or a bag, like a normal duffel bag. And they had insane ideas. So this is a really simple example of how do you design with people. And the moment that click happens in your mind, I think a lot of things become easier. A lot of things become open. Is it about stories? Because we can go on about the technical aspect of open source design or whatever, but it's the story which sells, or it's the story which people connect to. I'm sorry for people who are not from India, you might have a hard time connecting these two images. People from India, you might have come across these things. I hope you have. On the left, there's something called Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahuti. It's people who watch a lot of parallel cinema will think that this is highest level of bullshit. They might think like that. And on the right side, we have a movie which explore the concept of ship of Theseus. Like if I have a ship and I take apart all the components and replace all those components with another thing, is the ship real? So two the polar opposite ends. One is a very typical soap opera which has nonsense, and the other is a very deep philosophical thought. And there's a connection between them. It's done by the same guy.
Anand Ganguly.
Yeah. And for some, a lot of time, we take an elitist approach. We say that, oh, what others are doing is wrong. Like we can have problem in the Indian education system. Like we can crib all we want to crib about it. But at the end of the day, majority of the population doesn't care, or majority of the population is fine with it, right? So stories are really critical when it comes to taking a stand or pushing forward an idea. For some people, the left approach works. For some people, the right approach works. But the important part is stories are really critical to what you want to tell or what do you want to talk to people. One of the biggest question, control, because the basic premise of open source is based on the fact that there's apparently no control, or there's apparently lack of control, or there's a decentralized system. So, but are open source systems really not under any control, or is there a control, or is there no control? Is it about creating a non-realistic utopia? Oh, we need to be socialist in our approach, or consumerism is bad, capitalism is bad, and all those things? Or is it like taking stock of what is real and tinkering the world which is real around us, rather than going for a unicorn, tweaking what exists? So it's easy to create dystopias and utopias, but it's really difficult to deal with reality. So is open source about these unrealistic or non-realistic utopias, or is it about taking control of what is out there in the world and building with it? And is it about why? Like, why are we even talking about open source? Why are we even sitting, and why are you guys even listening to me? So there has to be some reason why someone is interested in open source, or why someone's interested in exploiting people. So if there's no why, there's no point of doing anything. Like for some people, the why is acknowledgement. For some people, why is power. So maybe the why is really personal. And unless we don't figure out the why, anything, whatever else we do doesn't make sense. And because I teach systems thinking at NID, this is something which is really important for us. There are a lot of ways you can change a system. The smallest level you can change a system is to change the constants, right? Then you can change the material. You can change the way the loops work. But the most difficult thing is to set a paradigm or a culture, right? So it's easy to differentiate between the products based on their looks, but it's very difficult to establish a culture. If you see companies like, when you go and take a photocopy, especially in India, when you go take a photocopy, you don't say, I'm going to take a photocopy. You say, I'm going to take a Xerox. So Xerox is culture. So it's very difficult to establish culture. So what you guys are going to do over a period of 1 year is going to be somewhere around establishing culture. And that's a really difficult thing to do. It's going to take time. It might and might not work. And it's going to be messy. And you have to be fine with the fact that the world is ambiguous and that's the way it is. So the sooner we factor in this reality, the better it might be for us. And humans are reality crunching machines. So we create maps of everything. And it's just that a lot of time when we are navigating the world, we move from one map to another map. So the entire exercise of going through this point is it's cartography. Like we are navigating the maps. So right now we are navigating a map of C3. The moment you're out of this, you'll be navigating a map of how do you build a pitch. And a couple of days down the line or months down the line, that map might change into building a community, and then how do you scale it up and all those things. So these maps keep on changing every now and then, and we navigate through them. And there's no absolute map. Like your map is not absolutely correct. My map is not absolutely correct. It's just the way we navigate the map is the important factor. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'll just briefly touch upon what Kamya had mentioned in the beginning about my work experience. And to be honest, I started looking at open source in India when Fab Labs were pretty new. And especially in India, we have this problem of not talking about ideas because we think that someone's going to steal our idea. That's the general case. I'm not saying that the group who's sitting here right now feels the same. Again, that's something which I feel. So we are not really open to talking about what we feel or what we like and what we don't like. And I studied in a place which is built on the idea of Bauhaus, right? So which believes really strongly in identities. And I started looking at this in 2014 as my systems design project. So systems design project is the last project we do at NID. It's a 10-week long project. And why we started looking at why do humans make stuff? What is so special about us that we want to make stuff? And why is there a disconnect between people because of technology? And what is the possibility of doing things? So over a period of time, we started looking at the city as a makerspace. And we had a lot of questions. Like we had questions like, can making be done on the go? Who are going to be these guys who are going to be the makers? What are we going to make? Can makers be change makers? So we started with all these sort of questions. And then I started doing my thesis project on the similar line. And I helped set up maker spaces for schools, for kids from 5-year to 17-year-old. We developed curriculum for them. I talked about the Prism project. So I started sharing more and more of my work. And while I was doing that, I started looking at a philosophical understanding, the why of it. And I think on your Miro board, there's an example of something called Open Design Manifesto. I did that like a couple of years back. Again, it's taken from the free software movement. And I reappropriated it to the perspective of design and navigating the world. And since then, whatever I've been doing, I've been putting out in the world. Like I blog, I publish Instructables. Then at NID, I specifically teach open source design. And a lot of work we do, we put it in the public domain. Yeah, that's what I've been up to. And that's how things have been going on. It's not been easy because definitely you get paid less, but it's not that you don't make money. You need to figure out ways. Like I make audio systems. There are plans of audio system, which if you want, you can go to Instructable right now, download the entire files and make a system for you. Then I also sell plans of those, and I also sell build systems. So you can make money, you can figure out economics of open source if you are willing to. That's only possible if you know how do you want to share your work, or what rights do you want to take ownership. So, and yeah, I've been making money, so I don't think that if you are practicing open source, you're going to die poor. So that's not the case. And the best thing which happened to me, I've got emails from people from Russia, people from Africa who were interested in the work I was doing. They were interested in collaborating. So that's why I ended up collaborating with a lot of companies which share the same sort of philosophy, and it has so far worked for me. And in India, there's a growing community, and I think what you guys have signed up has immense potential. The only thing is we need to wrap our head around the fact that what we are going to do is to be done for the real people. It's not for creating a utopia, which is difficult to realize. So my only suggestion will be realistic, and it should be designed with people rather than for people, because co-creation has immense potential. The moment we understand that, and it's difficult to convince people to get on board. Why would someone spend their time talking to you when they don't see any outcome, right? Everyone has an agenda. If you have an altruistic agenda, doesn't mean that other person has. So it becomes really important, like how do you share information and stories. Yes, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sahil. It looks like people are really enjoying your presentation. I think the references and the examples that you've showed have really pushed the boundaries of how we can think of this. But I would like to open the floor to all the community members to ask your questions. I think, OJ, you had a question a while ago. Would you like to unmute yourself and answer?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Hi, Sahil. So thank you for that presentation. It definitely gave a lot of food for thought for me, coming from as someone who has worked in makerspaces before. And my question was around, so when you mentioned about access, making the invisible visible, when we look at big algorithms, AI algorithms, because that's the trend these days, there is an element of interpretation, there is an element of interpretability, the ability to be able to understand why a certain outcome is that way. And in that respect, there has been a lot of conversation around biases, data imbalances, and it talks about underrepresented minorities and communities. I was wondering, when you don't even know that this kind of an audience exists, in the domain of application of your product or algorithm, how do you even find them, especially if these are supposedly black boxes?
Yes. So one thing I like to start with is, we had someone who came and said one thing really important is that someone right now sitting in Silicon Valley is creating a future for us. Whether we want that future or not is not even worth a question, is not even a question they think is worth asking. So that's why, first of all, the point you mentioned, that a lot of these things have inherent in bias, like it comes with a bias. And that was pretty evident when the chatbot, I think the Twitter chatbot or Microsoft chatbot, started going haywire and started writing really racist stuff. So especially when we think about AI, see, I'm not an expert, but I still see how it works. So it comes down to how do you train it, right? And you mentioned that sometimes these representative are not even considered. So that goes back to the fact that why are they not represented? Because maybe they are not aware, or maybe it doesn't matter to them. Like I said, we can have a problem with the education system, but it works for majority of the population. So is it again coming from a point of privilege, or that we have the resources to think about this? Is the reason we are thinking about this, right? And I'll give you an example, especially the example you saw about that anatomy of an AI. So when Vlad was making that entire map, he was being conscious of the fact that there are certain things which you cannot figure out, right? And all these things will come down to the fact of what is your intention. Like if your intention is to make money, or if your intention is to exploit data, then that's your base, right? You're going to train the entire thing based on that. If you have an intention of doing something which has certain philosophy into place, you'll make sure that it goes that way. But majority of the time that doesn't happen, because the real world works on capital, and no one wants to invest in a fairer world. Otherwise, we'll not have people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, right? I know I'm not answering directly what you were saying, but that's the way the real world is. And that's the entire point, that you tweak the system to make it a bit fairer. You cannot create a system which is totally fair. It doesn't exist, because it's again a utopia. So you can make it fairer in comparison to what exists already. That's what I believe in. And that also stems from the entire philosophy of the way Japanese craftsmen have been seen. So when we see a katana sword made by a Japanese swordsmith, we get into this wow factor. Oh, they are really highly skilled. But we forget that it's been something which has been perfected over a 2000-year-old period. They didn't start making the sword like now. So you can go towards making a fairer world, but I don't think you can create a system which is going to be totally unbiased, because humans are not unbiased, right? By our nature, we are not unbiased. We have unbiasedness ingrained in us by birth, whether that's according to race, language, color, or whatever. So we are looking for a utopia in a place which doesn't exist within ourselves, right? So you can only make a system fairer in comparison to what exists. So that's what I think in these terms.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question, but there are other people, I'm sure, in the line, so I'll wait my
Thank you,
turn.
Rajvi. Yes. Christian, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. That's an interesting input. But maybe I can add something from a more German, a very special German perspective, and I think that is something that is unique to the German-speaking part of Europe. Is that when we look at France and other key countries, maybe Spain and Italy, I would say that they would tune into what you said, and that's like this idea of like someone in Silicon Valley is making my future, and I can tune it, but somehow I cannot. I mean, I agree that you cannot make it perfect, right? But you cannot oppose to it. You have to somehow go with it and tune it. Well, our experience, at least in Germany, was that there is an extremely strong digital civic society, which actually does not, which works as a lobby, and through its power and opposition actually has gained an impressive influence into forcing those who think and make. I mean, we don't have an influence on Silicon Valley as well, but we have influence on our own government, into making things that into tweaking them for us in such a way, right? So the best part is with the coronavirus crisis, Germany also like developed an app, and other countries such as France and Spain, they had very weird implementations with location tracking. And through the strong influence of the German civic society, actually the government looked for a solution that went completely on an anonymous base. Obviously, it did not it did not work in the same way that other apps worked. So like some things actually, it was more or less useless in the beginning of the pandemic because the legislation demanded something that was not possible to achieve with anonymity, anonymous apps and tracking. But now we have reached a way that actually the legal system has also joined into allowing this project to work. And not only is it anonymous, but it is also open source. So the government actually spent, I think, 45 million euros at Deutsche Telekom, so German Telecom, and SAP, which is for those who don't know, SAP is the equivalent of Salesforce. For them actually to provide an open source app. So I do think that actually by building a community and connecting those communities, because those communities, like they are in Germany, they exist worldwide. I believe they exist in India, they exist in the US as well. It's, I mean, everywhere where there are computers, you have digital communities around it. But it's also very important that they are linked, because I think the only difference between this German community and the one in France is that the one in France actually is loosely connected and the one in Germany is strongly connected. And this connection comes purely from a philosophical motivation, from an ethical motivation. There's no tech involved actually. Like on the tech level, there is no cooperation. It's purely a idealistic connection. And I think that's important to actually come together on a technical motivation, right? But to connect on a ideological motivation.
Yeah, that's why I also said in the presentation, the why of it is really important, right? So the why is the philosophical part. And until and unless you don't share this why with people, again, it exists somewhere in your brain, or it exists somewhere nicely on a sheet of paper or a slide. So the only way of doing this is opening up. Yeah,
I think it also lives from some kind of conflict, and that's what I realized with the Corona crisis here and the digital implementation, that actually the only solution, and I think that at the end, I mean, there would have been better solution, but that's also in the nature of politics to do one thing. But actually, they moved in an open source and free and anonymous way in one way, but at the same time, the legal system did not move immediately in that way. But it's part of that actually you cannot do it perfect on the first turn, but also maybe now with the pandemic being in a different state, I don't say it's under control, but it's in a different state, it is possible to actually make it have work. Also with the user base having grown, so yeah. Someone wrote in the chat, iterative evolution. Yeah. It's very fast iterative evolution compared to the natural evolution. And it's also less fun to see iterative evolution if you're at the core and the center of it. But yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I forgot to mention is that for me, I got into open source because of biases, because I'm from a place called Jammu. A lot of you might have heard about Jammu and Kashmir. So as a kid, I've always seen denial of access, or somewhere or the other, how do you create a roadblock? So as a kid, I experienced how a system works and how system stops people from doing things. So maybe that psychologically on some level, that was the reason that I wanted things to be a bit more open. And the sort of things I faced as a kid, I didn't want others to also feel that. So maybe I think for me, it was the bias which I experienced, or the biased world I experienced as a kid. Maybe that also helped shape the way I looked at the world or did things later on. Yeah.
So there are a few more questions in the chat, but I have a feeling some of it has to do with the ideas of collaboration. How do you collaborate with people? What happens when they don't want to collaborate with you? When you're designing with people? But I feel like this conversation, and by the way, I'm addressing some of your questions there, will be the next thing that we'll discuss as a group. So I'd like to move this on to the next thing that we do. Kartika, to you. Sahil, please feel free to hang on, because after this small interlude, we'll have some more discussions about collaboration and what it can mean.
Yeah, and I'll also share the slide I had, because some of you were interested in the project. So I'll be more than happy to send it across to you guys. And I've given the sources. So yeah.
Thank you. So Kartika, over to you for our little exercise on understanding the pitches and proposals that are going to come.
All right. So to get a sense of where everyone is at, I understand that not all of us can be outgoing and vocal in a group of 100. I think we were going to do a small Miro exercise to get a sense of how many people would like to pitch in November, and how many of you are already in groups, how many of you are still looking for collaborators. A lot of you are not active on Dara, so that's becoming a little difficult for people to reach out to you. So please, can we all open up Miro for a bit? Somewhere at the bottom, over here on the bottom right, underneath the tables, you will find this space. So what we would like you to do, as you can see an example here, we are the BF team, Kartika, Kamya, Jones, and Hanish, and we are, well, I would say up to capacity at this point. So what we do is people who have already been, so just type in your names here, drag it over to a circle and link it. So if you are open to more collaborators, maybe 3 of you are talking to each other and you would like a 4th person to join you, please use one of these green circles to do this. Blue circles are, well, you're not sure yet. Let's talk. Let's see if there's something we can do together. And if groups are already formed, please head over to the red circles over here and put your names on there. This is so that we can all get a sense of how many people are still looking, how many people are sorted, and how many people would like more opportunities to talk to one another. So please take some time to do this little exercise.
Just to say, for those of you who don't have the Miro link, we put it in the chat just now.
Well, green is if you've already sort of have 2 or 3 people and you're in communication, you're okay. You're just looking for one more person. Blue is just you're completely, you have no idea. You want to start this process, and this will also help us create more opportunities for you to interact.
And for those who are going to be pitching in November, please title your project along in that red circle. Just tell us the title of the project.
Yes, as you can see, someone's already done it here, the color app. Thank you, Akanksha. So just rename this to your project title, working title.
And if we need more red dots, we can just copy and paste.
Copy and paste from here, yes.
Or maybe we can do it as well, Kartika.
Yes. Do let me know if you need any more.
Please feel free to unmute yourself and talk if something's not working out. For those of you who are filling the green circles and you're open to more collaborators, it might be interesting to give a sense of what your project's about.
So you can hit the comment button and add looking for someone with
Yeah.
dash experience, someone who could help. Do drop in a comment. Kamya, would you like to take that question? Is it possible to propose a project alone?
We need one collaborator from the community. Amrita,
Okay.
Christian, is that right? We do need you to collaborate with one other person from the C-Cube community.
Yeah, that would, yes.
If you see any green circles that you're interested in the topic, leave a comment there for them in case you are someone who's looking to join another group. Do leave comments on each other's projects, expressing your interest.
So Sujay, you need to make a green circle for yourself. And the more detail you put into your comment of the kind of collaborator you foresee would help your project, the more we as a team can help go through CVs and kind of put you in touch with somebody likely. So please, if for those of you who are searching for collaborators, please try to nuance what kind of person you'd like and give your project a little bit more, a couple of lines to explain your project would really help for us to understand.
Okay, Kamya, I think we're
Ready for the next thing?
ready for the next. Yes.
Okay. Thank you all, and the board will stay open. This is not something that needs to end right away. So we will keep the board open, and for those who are not here, we have about 50% of the community here today, or a little bit less. We will send out communications to the others to partake in this exercise. Yeah, and with that, we move on.
Is Shreyansh here?
Yep.
Yeah, so we will invite Shreyansh to articulate his thoughts over the next 5 to 7 minutes, after which he kind of will open it up to all of you to give feedback and share your experiences. So Shreyansh, take it away.
Thank you, Kamya. And thank you, Sahil, for that really wonderful presentation. Speaking in the vein of Sahil, when he spoke about co-creation, my thought was, how do we co-create a community with each other? What do the different members of the community need from each other? What are their own needs? How are these needs articulated? And how can these needs then be met and honored with respect, dignity, and transparency? so the thing I'm getting at with all these with all these flowery languages, I got a sense not only within this community that we are building, but like other tech communities that I am a part of. Like there's a processing community group in Delhi that I am a part of, and I get the sense that there always tends to be this huge gulf, a gap between tech-based practitioners and more traditional heritage humanities practitioners, and to me that was a little disheartening, because at the end of the day we are both people. So tech is in a way a subset of humanities as well. So I was thinking, what can we do to like bridge the gap between digital technologists and more traditional technologists and humanities practitioners. And so I sort of made a mind map of myself, brainstorming after conversations with some of my collaborators, etc. Kartika, would it be possible for you to? Yeah, thank you. So this is the mind map that I made, and it has some questions, and I will be adding it to the Miro board as well, so that like you have access to it outside of this. Oh, it's already on the Miro board. Excellent. So it's already on the Miro board. So yeah, so some of the questions that came to me were, I'll just read them out to you. So how do we bridge the divide between the humanities and digital technology? What do you need from me to feel safe, to feel seen, to feel respected and dignified? What are the acknowledged and unacknowledged assumptions and myths about each other that we are holding on to or getting in the way of open exchange and dialogue? How do we create an atmosphere of trust and safety that works for practitioners of digital technological humanities and non-digital humanities? And how do we facilitate an open exchange or sharing of repositories? So like we talk about repositories in open source through platforms like GitHub, etc. But can we like also like sort of walk away from it? Because what's in here is also a repository, right? Like we have like learned knowledge that we have inherited from our from the previous generation, and we have self-realized knowledge that we have discovered through our own inquiries into ourselves and into our practices and the world around us. And we have received knowledge through textbooks and other resources, etc. So we all are walking repositories. We all have our set of skills and expertise. How do we open this up? How do we open this source to each other, so that the cultures can emerge, which lead to very strong communities? I mean, there are many other questions, like and there's some jokes written in there as well, like how like traditional farmers and digital farmers need to be talking to each other and blah 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 blah. So I'll just leave you to check that. One of the things that I thought like I could share in terms of my own experiences in collaborating with people when it comes to successful and unsuccessful collaborations is one. I found that like whenever I'm looking for a collaborator as a body with a set of skills, there isn't really much of an emotional connection that is formed between me and the collaborator. And also, like if I don't find out what is it that presses the collaborators buttons and what is it that they want to do, it does not really work well for the project that we're working on together, because there is no investment there in the project that we are building. And likewise, sometimes like when I meet collaborators who might not have the skill sets that I need, but the energy is so good that and we talk to each other, and the level of trust and connection is so great that even if they don't have the skill sets that I need to that I am looking for specifically, I find that so they do happen to have some other skill set which can sort of like result in an alternative deployment of the idea that we are looking at, as long as we keep our expectations open and we don't latch on too hard to things, ideas like ambition and ego. And like if we can find a way to like set that aside, like I find that it does help. However, like I am also human, so there are many times that I goof up. So I wouldn't say that, you know, I know all the answers. That would be incredibly wrong. And like we have such a wonderful, rich collection of individuals and people within this space. I thought, like, I'm sure many of us have stories about good and bad experiences that maybe we can share if we are comfortable with, of course, and maybe, like, you know, sort of maybe sort of like add more richness to the collective repository that we are inhabiting right now within this community, and find if a culture that works for all of us emerges from this exchange. And mind you, like this, like one last parting thought before I open up the floor is that I, like, through my experience, this is not something that one does, an exercise that one does once and forgets about. This is something that we need, that I find that in successful collaborations and successful communities, like if we do a check-in on a regular basis as to what was needed and what was not working for you, and like what was triggering for you, and like we take those things on board and make adjustments and move forward, then we can build a high level of trust and safety and respect to each other, which can then result in good, strong communities. And with that, I'll just shut my trap, and would like to invite you to come forward and share a story that you have, where it might be a successful collaboration, not so successful collaboration. Maybe it's a story of like of a digital technologist who likes to get in touch with their funky side and go a little, more fluid with things, and go more artsy with it. I don't know who's inhabiting this room, but I ask you, if you can, please come forward and share your stories and your learnings from these experiences. Thank you.
And if you could raise your hand, that would be kind of nice to do. Anybody has the story to share for what made a collaboration successful? So honestly, what we're trying to do here is to develop a rules of engagement that we co-create in the nature of some of the conversations Sahil has had with us. So can we co-create a set of rules of engagement for our own community and its practice? So anybody who has a story of an absolute disaster or something that really worked well, please raise your hands and we will have you on. Akanksha, please go.
Hi. Yeah, so I guess I have a story I can share about, a successful collaboration in a more of a professional setting, but I think that, it may be relevant to what we are trying to do here. So this is actually from many years ago. I was working at this company where we were building 3D printed insoles, and it was a very small startup. And our team was, the whole company was about 20 people, and our team consisted of the team that was building the product, that consisted of industrial designers, biomechanical engineers, architects, and computer scientists. It was very interesting because, like you mentioned, it was people coming from so many different backgrounds. And we were all working together to create that same final product. And it was more interesting because it was actually a physical product that we were producing. And so I think with that experience, the thing that was most interesting was that there was just such a difference in the language that all of us used to communicate. Like the same things, the same actions, our set of tools were different, professionally especially, right? Like everybody, even for things like notes taking or sharing very, very basic information, sharing work, sharing everything, that whole, our whole repository of language, of tools, of everything was so different that one of our biggest challenges was, how do we effectively communicate? How do you kind of get people talking the same language? even when we were talking about the product, people were always approaching from different perspectives, looking at it like the same thing just meant different things to different people. And that actually, I think, was one of my favorite projects I've ever worked at, just because of that diversity of that group and the amount that I learned from them on, how to approach that. And so I think that, like you mentioned, right, that there is like skills and tools and all that, but to make a successful collaboration, I think the focus needs to be on how to make that communication effective and making sure that people are not feeling like they are out of their depth with the language or the tools or like the kind of communication strategies that are being used. That's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Akanksha. Varun, you have your hand up.
Yes. I'm not sure if I'm visible,
You are.
but you can hear me.
Yeah.
We work in the performing arts, and one of the really the thing about performing arts in India is there are no safety practices. There's a very much a tradition of Guru Shishya, which is you don't ask the teacher anything, and that's something that's been tough to really come across and try to challenge. So my work is in improvisation. In 2018, I received a grant from the Goethe Foundation, like C3, to create a production that explored mental health. We were going to tell stories about our real life experience with depression and anxiety. What became really evident very quickly is that performers are not the best people in the world to decide their own safety. Often than not, performers are going to push themselves into unsafe areas because they think it's best for the production. So what's really important when we realize, one is documentation. So in the chat, I've put 3 documents that we have shared. One is our online safe space practice. One is the research study that we're now conducting into safety in the performing arts, that's looking into safety of performers, of audiences, and venue safety. And finally, a code of conduct. The code of conduct is really important because there's an enforcement procedure and a reporting procedure, which means if there's an incident, action will be taken. But if I take everything, like our 3 years of work in safety and collaboration, and boil it down, it comes down to some very basic things. One is consent. Everything is done with consent. The consent has to be given freely. It has to be enthusiastic. It is reversible. People can take it back. You have to understand that when someone is working with you, they need to understand everything that's going to that's their responsibility. And the second is really defining roles and responsibilities. When you're working with performers and you're a director and there's a technical producer, or if you're working in an organization, you need to know that this is how much is the area that I'm going to be responsible for. And we use improvisation games to define these. I can play multiple games with you online just to show you how you can establish collaboration and build trust by playing improv games, where really what you're going to define is how do we work with consent? How do we establish roles and responsibilities and follow through with them? And finally, the third thing is really simple too, no judgment. We don't create judgment. We evaluate, certainly. We try to take ideas and see how they work, but we have to create an environment where you're not judging everybody for everything. If someone shares an idea, if the first thing they're getting is judgment, they will not continue brainstorming or sharing ideas with you. What you need to do is take the idea on board. What works for you is great. What doesn't work for you, you don't have to take it. But you don't sit there tearing down someone's idea. So basically, it's these 3 principles for us: consent, defining roles and responsibilities, and working with no judgment.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add to that there is this one documentation called the Liz Lerman's method of critique when it comes to like creative projects. So you could, like, Liz Lerman was a choreographer. Is a choreographer. She's not dead yet, and she created this structure, this structured way of giving feedback for a particular project or an idea, which first of all takes into account consent from the maker themselves, because sometimes the maker might not be in a space where they're really ready for critique yet. Not because they're sensitive, they just need, even when they present an idea, there is a physiological process that goes on in the body. So the body also needs to like settle down, the mind needs to settle down, and like consent is and thank you so much for bringing that up. Like consent is such a complex thing. Like sometimes we might consent without even knowing that we don't want to give consent under pressure or under perceived pressure because of past experiences and oppression and trauma. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add I mean, I'll add it to the repository on Miro later. Like, but there is this really lovely document on how to provide feedback and critique by Liz Lerman. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you, Shreyans. Sarvesh, and if you can keep it a bit short, I think we're kind of running to the end of this, but yeah.
Hi. So I was involved with the design and construction of a school in a flood-prone area in Assam some time back. And in my experience, the most amazing thing that can happen during an open source collaboration is that the solutions can come from the most unexpected places. And we have to remain open to that. And just to build on what just Shreyans and Varun said about, suspending judgment and yet being able to evaluate the proposition. That is the way to go in any community for that matter.
Shreyans, do you have a response, or can we move to Preeta?
No, please let's move to Preeta.
Thank you, Sarvesh.
Hey, hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my connection isn't good enough for a video to work right now. But I wanted to riff off of what Varun said about using improvisation techniques to create a safe space for people to open up. And for me, something that has been extremely helpful is connecting with people online, like over like intensives and workshops during the pandemic, when like everything was online and I could talk to people like across the country where with dance companies I wouldn't have known about earlier. And surprisingly enough, we did manage to create a space where I felt I belonged for the first time in my 20 years of career as a, in movement arts. And it was really mind-blowing for me. And I think a very important reason why it was so comfortable, that experience, was because like we had this space of like we could like sort of, I don't know how we did it, and I would love to recreate that using improvisations or storytelling and sharing, really made each other feel accepted, and that everyone's ideas, there was value for everybody's, to everybody's ideas, something that was being discussed in the like the presentation earlier, about that everybody has some skills to offer. And we really, grew sharing skills and backgrounds, and because each of us came from such different culture, and like there was more of collaboration than competition, and a lot of listening happened, and that was extremely helpful. So yeah, that's it really.
Thank you so much, Preeta. Yeah, listening is such a listening while suspending our own expectations can bring about can open up so much more possibilities. I find, like in terms of like not only life but also in terms of like actual collaborative spaces. I just wanted to add also like all these things that we are talking about are we may not be able to do it all consistently all the time, because there are so many years and years of like embodied baggage and like ways of functioning that we might slip every once in a while. So it's also important that we are compassionate towards ourselves, and like we forgive ourselves, and like like reflect on it, and like try to find out how we can do it better the next time for ourselves. Yeah.
Great. So any other last thoughts, people?
I would just like to say something like, I apologize if the presentation was boring or it went into all sort of directions, because that's the way we deal with complexity at NID, or that's the way we deal with complexity, because things connect, and it might seem random to some people, but these are the connections, or these are the examples we've built over a couple of years. So they might not straight away fit into certain ideas of open source or not, but they have certain features of that. And because of whatever time limit we have, it had to make sense in some way or the other. And in case you guys want to chat up about anything later on, or according to your convenience, or anything you want to talk about, uh, please feel free. I can drop my email in the chat box for you guys. And yeah, that's the simplest way to get.
That would be perfect. Thank you, Sahil. I think we will need your kind of, sounding board space. So please do that.
I have a question for Sahil, like if you don't mind.
Sure.
Sahil, are you based in Bombay? And also, like, are you open to some thoughts / feedback about the presentation?
I'm based out of Ahmedabad. I teach full time at NID. So yeah, and especially for your presentation, I know it's a very hard thing to figure out people who are interested. And a lot of time what happens is, because the initial few people we talk to and they end up not being interested, we feel that this idea doesn't have value or it's not worthwhile. But the thing is that it's fine to stick with rejection for a while and still keep on going, because that is the place where the why becomes really personal and taking ownership becomes important. So if this is something which makes sense to you, I think among the 7 billion people who are on the planet, it makes sense to someone else also. So it's just the point or a matter of time to find that person. And even if you find one person who connects with that, that's the beginning, right? So yeah, rejection is part of the game, and
yeah,
that's fine. And it's going to be hard. Like, I think I was talking to someone on a personal chat about when we did the prison project. Yeah, we faced initially, they were reluctant to talk, but the moment you genuinely really want to talk to people, people will open up. And it comes down to the fact that you can see it from someone's body language, right? And as someone was saying, observation is really critical. So I think whether you want to be a person in open source or to be a good human, you need to first observe and read body language. If you can't do that, yeah, that's going to be a problem. So that would be my suggestion, that don't get disheartened by rejection. You'll find people who will be interested in figuring out something.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I absolutely agree with all of the above. And also wanted to say that if you have difficulty with body language, like it's a learnable skill, and also, pay attention to your inner instinct, because often it is quite on the money when it comes to interpreting somebody. And also always check in with somebody. That might be a little odd at first, but like it can help in the long run once yeah, like things are a little more comfortable.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, one last thing. Like I asked if you would, if you had any thought, if you would like a thought about your presentation. Do you want that?
Pardon?
Like I asked if you would like a thought about your presentation. Do you would you be interested in that, or should I just?
Sure.
Yeah. So like throughout your presentation, I found myself quietly chuckling, and like towards the end, I thought, like, have you like considered trying stand up, or do you do stand up? Because there might be some really interesting learnings from that avenue as well.
I personally feel that I might die before I'm supposed to die because of saying something wrong at the wrong time. Because I can't differentiate, or people cannot differentiate whether I'm being sarcastic or I'm being serious. And that a lot of time comes out in the way I talk. And I'm a very jumbled person in my head because connections exist for me. They seem very weird to other people, but they do exist, and that comes out in all sort of weird ways in presentation. So usually I'm all over the place, and I'm a stand-up comedian in my class, so I end up making people happy. And there's a German saying of form follows function. I think form follows fun. If you're not having fun in what you're doing, it's worthless, to be honest. Like if you're not having fun in doing what you're doing, then you better be a vegetable, right? Like that's better to do rather than being miserable in what you're doing. So I have fun in the things I do.
Thank you so much for sharing that you're a jumble person as well, because then it gives me more pride about my own way of functioning. Thank you.
Yes, Sahil, that honesty is refreshing for sure. Kartika, I think the most important part of today is to talk about pitches versus proposals.
Yes, it is not yet on the Miro, but we will put it on there. The distinctions, but do we want to go over the distinctions? All right, so we know that the pitching session is scheduled for the 11th of November. So wanting to clarify and distinguish between the proposals and the pitches. So the pitches is what you deliver during the session. And it will be a 2-hour event. And if you are going to pitch, you will have 3 minutes to make your pitch along with your group that you have. And you will get 2 minutes of clarifications by some jurors, bringing in some people to give you some feedback or ask clarifying questions. So totally that gives you 5 minutes. And I will send you a Miro space where you need to put your name and your group mates. That's all you need to do to tell us that you're going to be pitching on the 11th of November. And post that, you will have some more time to type up the proposal itself. And we will give you the requirements shortly.
Actually, yeah, we will give you the requirements like the end of today.
Yes.
It would be good if you could, in parallel, create your proposal. Yes. So on the word get go, as soon as we give you the requirements, please start typing up your proposal. The proposal is the written matter, which will include project title, what kind of open source you are looking at, how does it benefit a civil society issue, who's your group member, what is the budget going to be used for. So it has a series of requirements that you will need to write up and send in to us. Like Kartika said, the pitch is a short summary of your proposal. You are pitching to jurors, you're not pitching to collaborators or your audience, your community. It's just an opportunity for the juror to hear really how you feel about it, and like, you know, that whole kind of qualitative feel about a proposal that you don't get from reading it, but you get from watching somebody deliver it. So that's the difference between a pitch and a proposal. The proposal is the written content that the jurors will go through and make their decision. The pitch is the snappy 3-minute one. All of you did fabulously on day one when you came with your elevator pitches. It's very similar to that. And the jurors will have a couple of minutes to clarify questions, not really give you feedback, but clarify questions. And in those clarifications, you should be able to sense where you're not making enough sense. So we do give you a few days after to clean up proposals in case you need it, and then send it in to us for its review. Yeah. We have also started an FAQ kind of brain dump space, and some of you have already started populating that. Should we share screen?
Yes, I'm sharing screen.
So on Miro, you'll see this space that is asking you to put in any of these confusions that you have with regard to the pitch and the proposal. And this will get into our guidelines that we send you very soon. So please take a day or two to fill this out. And by tomorrow evening, we'll send you an entire set of requirements, including FAQs answered, to give you a better sense of what this whole thing's about. If any of you have questions now, please ask it and we can put it in there as well. The template itself with the requirements of the proposal will be sent to you. We're just waiting to listen, to hear out what the FAQs are. We have our stuff typed out. We just want to hear from you where your biggest dilemmas are so that we can address that and send you one coherent template.
Kamya, there's a question. Can we be part of multiple projects?
Yes, you can. But Amrita, maybe you can answer that. If you're part of multiple projects, does it decrease the likelihood of a project being selected? Not really, right? Or
No, no, we go by like the merit of the project, and you can be part of multiple projects. That's not an issue.
Yeah, but please leave all these kinds of questions on the FAQs. It'll really help us answer all your dilemmas. Clearly, if you are confused, somebody else in the group is likely to be having the same question. So please don't feel afraid to ask. This is that safe space we're trying to build. Give us your questions and we will find answers between Amrita and Christian and get back to you. Sujay asks, is it possible to get some feedback on our pitch and proposal? Again, a question that we can answer at the FAQ. Anish, if you can cut some of these questions and put it on the Miro board for us, that would be convenient.
Can you join or withdraw from a project after the projects are chosen? Yes, this is a similar question on the FAQ board. I'm going to drop it in there.
So we won't necessarily be answering these questions right now. Please give us more such questions. We will collate them and get them answered and give them back to you. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today, folks.
Yes, and Ravinder, if you want to stay behind, I could do a quick Miro tutorial if required.
And for anybody else who'd like to stay behind, we have 10 minutes to do a quick video, Miro tutorial as well. But before everybody drops off, there's an end session poll. I know many people have dropped off. We have what, 10 people who've dropped off. But Hanish, if we could launch the poll, and while that is happening, Sahil, thanks a lot for being here and sharing with us.
I think Sahil left. Yes.
Already, but I guess I thank him anyway. We might look at getting him back on at some point again to help people. And there is a sharing board and a feedback board on Miro.
Yes.
If any of you are not getting what you need, please leave your thoughts there. If you're feeling loose and unsupported, tell us what kind of support you require, and we'd be happy to address it. So we do look at Miro quite often. So please leave us messages there at a later point as well.
Kamya, just one question. This is perhaps a little premature given the stage we're at right now, but do you think there is any merit in sort of having more frequent self-organized check-ins that are open to people, so to like kind of like keep those conversations about culture, trust, community, etc. going? Is that something worth thinking about?
Sure. So like we just put out a call there and then whoever joins. Is that something like what you're thinking about?
Yeah.
Sure. And
Yes, we
even
do
if,
have other spaces apart from Zoom that allow you to join in whenever you would like. It's more of an open space. So yeah, we will communicate that with you if more people show interest. So maybe put that on Dara and get people to give you a thumbs up. Get a sense of how many
Yeah,
people are
that's a great
interested.
idea. Thank you. Yeah.
great. Christian, Amrita, any last thoughts before everybody runs off and does their pitches and proposals?
No, but it was a very interesting discussion. Thank you for everybody who participated.
Yeah, same here. I mean, all good, and it was it's good to listen in. Yeah.
Superb. All right, everybody. Thank you for your time and good night and good luck.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, everybody. Bye.